Anybody know who Alan Kay is? All these bizarre references or something. Huh? Alan Kay is a computer scientist. He said the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I like to use this 66-year time frame because 66 years is what it takes you to go from the sands of Kitty Hawk to the Sea of Tranquility. 66 years. Fact. Okay? Some people think we should just take agriculture backwards. I'm not one of them. And so I think we need to look forward to embracing technology and making agriculture a whole lot better than it is today. If I, again, just try and have some perspective, remember 250,000 years of modern humans, 10,000 years of agriculture, but we've only rediscovered Mendel's laws about 100 years ago, right? Mendel, the pea plants, right? 1900. Hybrid genetics, I showed you, was about 1935. DNA is the genetic material, Bob. What was it, 1946? 1945, 1946 was DNA, was Avery et al., right? It was 46? Excuse me, 44. I get a D, right? And so you see, right, all of this stuff that's, okay, I chose sort of a 100-year time frame, but what will the next 66 years bring? Now, I'm admittedly a techno-optimist, but we will continue to see accelerated yield increase from marker-assisted breeding. And so Monsanto, which, by the way, has been the #1 Fortune 500 stock over the past 5 years, they announced their quarterly earnings, and they said that by 2030, they will double the yields. They will double the yields of each of their core crops, corn, cotton, and soybean. They will double the yields by 2030, and they will do that with 1/3 fewer inputs. Okay, so they're going to do that. We'll see broader adoption of hybrids. They also announced that their drought-tolerant corn would be on the market in as little as 2 years. And this gives, what is it, I think a 10% higher yield under drought conditions or something like that. We're also going to see recombinant DNA products and corn plants with improved nitrogen use efficiency. So you can put less fertilizer on, presumably less fertilizer runoff as well. In the midterm, I just mentioned this, doubling of corn yields by 2030. If we needed to, we could easily quadruple global grain yields by 2030. Didn't say it was going to be easy, but we could do it. And in the long term, if we, right, with necessity as the mother of invention, do I think we could go after nitrogen-fixing grain crops and perennial grain crops? Well, we know there's perennial grains out there now. They're not nearly as high yielding, but we could potentially do it. I'm an optimist, and I wouldn't say no. I don't know, Bob, I'll put you on the spot. What would you say? Do you think it could be done? Do you think it could be done even faster? But all of it is going to require genetic manipulation. Don't have a head-in-the-sand approach that thinks that you're not going to manipulate plant genes to do this. We've been doing it for 10,000 years. Oh, look, there's our fun question again. Okay, I think that might be it. I don't know what else is in this presentation. Oh, no, I got more to talk. Everybody staying with me? Staying awake? Okay, keep going. Water break. So let's build a better biofuel, because cornstarch ethanol at the end of the day is not the answer, right? If we can imagine a perfect energy crop, what would it have? Well, chances are it would be a monocot. Okay, it would have what's called C4 photosynthesis. Everybody remember what a monocot is? Monocots, dicots. So remember when you were dissecting lima beans on your plate as a child, and they sort of fall apart into two halves? Those are cotyledons. Dicots, dicotyledon. Monocots, think of a rice grain, single cotyledon. And so the monocots are grasses. They tend to have long, narrow leaves. They also conduct something that's called C4 photosynthesis that right out of the box is, what is it, about 30% more efficient than C3 photosynthesis. So you want them to be very photosynthetic efficient. You'd want them to have this, what I call higher improved composition and structure. So if you're at all familiar with the oil business, you know that you don't refine a barrel of West Texas Intermediate and a barrel of Venezuelan heavy the same way. In fact, you do it in two completely different refineries. Why would you think biomass is any different? It's not. And so can we have, I call it the energy crop that melts in your mouth. So can we improve the composition to make it easier to refine? You'd want to have these, disease and pest resistance. I'll show you some pictures of switchgrass, show you some pictures of rice. But one of the things that we've done in rice over thousands of years is we've bred for a more upright leaf angle. Okay, switchgrass is still kind of a sprawly plant. Anybody think, why would we breed for a more upright leaf angle in rice? More, somebody said more. More density, right? Population density, you get more plants per acre, right? One of the big drivers of yield growth, right? And you guys by now have read through this stuff, and so that's what a perfect energy crop would look like. Now, when we started Ceres, it was around the time Phil Abelson made this quote, and we decided to take these genomics technologies, right, and apply them to plants. And what was happening here was this real sort of technological discontinuity where we went from being able to sequence sort of 1,000 base pairs a week to now we can do about 1 million a day or more, okay? So there's a great opportunity to go out there and sequence and characterize lots and lots of genes, which is what we at Ceres have been doing. And what we've been able to do is find genes that, and I'll show you some examples, that lead to stress tolerance, things like drought tolerance, cold tolerance, heat tolerance, so that we can grow energy crops on acreage where you're not going to get the greatest food yields. We increase the tons per acre, and I'll show you how important this is in terms of transporting biomass around. We want to reduce the nitrogen requirements. We want to improve the composition and structure. And we actually have one program at Ceres where we're actually making a plastic precursor inside a plant, so that you would actually take this plant, take it to the refinery. Most of it would go to fuel, and some of it you would actually take to making the plastic that is in fact plexiglass. So yield matters, and yield matters a great deal. So if you imagine your hypothetical biorefinery here at the center of this, if you're out collecting stover, like corn stover, the stuff that's typically left in the field, well, you can pull that off at about 2 tons per acre. But you still got to drive that truck an awful long ways, right, to transport it to the biorefinery. By contrast, if you have an energy crop at 20 tons per acre, you've shrunk that collection radius by 90%, and you can see it has a logarithmic impact on the cost delivered to the refinery gate. So yield density matters. All biomass is local, and you want to drive things towards yield in the field in order to drive these costs down. Feedstock cost at the biorefinery gate is the #1 cost in this game. And of those costs, harvest and transportation costs and the labor associated with them are the #1 costs. So you've got to drive yield. So perhaps not surprisingly, we've got genes that make plants bigger. We've got lots of them. This happens to be genes in a rice plant. Same genes work in things like switchgrass and miscanthus. We have genes that cause plants to require less fertilizer. This happens to be in a Arabidopsis plant, and you see the wild type and the improved variety there. Much happier, healthier plant there. A little bit of insect damage. I have to click on it here. This is drought tolerance. Where's my? There you go. Going kind of slow. Yeah. So this is over 2 days, and you can see the control plant just wilts over and dies, and the improved plant with drought tolerance is doing just fine, and it just loops. We've already been able to find, certainly in switchgrass, genes that lead to improved composition. So here, remember I was talking about these enzymes, these Pac-Men of cellulases and hemicellulases, the things that were really expensive, $5.50 a gallon down to 32 cents a gallon. So we take these things and we ask, okay, how much do we need to throw at different switchgrass cultivars in order to get some ethanol yield? And what you see is that this line is so much easier to digest that with 10 times less enzyme, you get even more ethanol yield, right? The impact on that, of course, is it reduces your enzyme cost, reduces your capital cost, reduces productivity. So getting to this crop that melts in your mouth is an important thing to have feedstocks that are easier to digest and refine. So the crops that we work on are switchgrass, and that's one of our scientists walking through a field of switchgrass. It's what used to be on the tallgrass prairie. So it's indigenous, it's well adapted to the United States. It's a perennial, meaning it's like the grass in your lawn. It'll grow back every year, but most importantly, it propagates from seed. The yields today are 10 tons an acre, maybe a little bit north of that. The input requirements, what we put on is about 1/8 of the fertilizer that is typically used in a cornfield. So it doesn't go no fertilizer. It can, but you don't get yields that are as high. But it's much lower input requirements than corn. We also work in this high biomass sorghum variety. This is a non-irrigated land in central Texas. That's me, obviously, in the cornfield. That's 83 days worth of growth. And yields today are actually well north of 15 tons per acre. It's an annual. It's pretty drought tolerant. Water requirements are about 2/3 of what you need to put in corn. And nonetheless, we think a very big biomass producer. We also work in a crop called miscanthus, which is a very rapidly growing Asian grass. And the drawback to miscanthus today is that it propagates from cuttings. And so, again, your farm labor costs are very high to propagate miscanthus. Lest you think that we just sit around in the labs all the time, we have commercialized this. So we have a brand called Blade Energy Crops, and we have a website, and we have started taking our first seed bookings. We've, in fact, started selling seed to farmers who want to begin to grow switchgrass and high biomass sorghum to establish the yield potential in their geographies, and that's all going quite well. Oh, look, there's our friendly question again. I think I've convinced you at this point. Oh, even more. Yeah, now I'm reaching them. Now I'm reaching them. That's right. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, good. They're learning. Okay, so here's another question. So should societies embrace the use of plant biotechnology to increase crop yields for food, feed, fiber, and fuel? Let's stop. Okay, so somebody's still not entirely comfortable with ag biotech, but I'm not going to put them on the spot. Bob will. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say. So I'm happy to take any questions, continue the conversation. What time?
Any questions?
There's
Eden,
one.
the Garden of Eden.
You talked a little bit about the farming conditions in Brazil and
Yep.
sort of the troubles that farmers had there. I just remember a couple years ago I heard a presentation about growing corn in Mexico.
Uh-huh.
But I'm just curious on what your input on that, or if we're using the corn crop from Mexico.
Can you hear up in Davis?
Yeah, I think the issue there was people were saying that the price of tortillas was going up in Mexico because of corn biofuel production, and there's no question that the price of corn went up, but it went up in response to high oil prices, right? As I tried to articulate earlier. So, but as far as corn cultivation in Mexico, that's where corn came from, and so yeah, corn is still cultivated in Mexico today. It gets cultivated around the world. Perhaps the sad part is again, I think if you go back to the early 70s, the world record for corn yield per acre used to be held by Rhodesia, and today it's Zimbabwe, and it's agriculturally a train wreck. It's a train wreck just about every other way. So, it speaks to the yield potential in the world and the things that we do to screw it up. Burma used to be called the Rice Bowl of Asia, and now it's Myanmar. And the generals have turned that into yet another train wreck. So poverty and lack of agricultural productivity seem to go hand in hand with poor government.
Stephen?
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Is there a way through genetic technology that we could make plants that reduce the greenhouse gas output?
Yeah. Yes, I think this was up on your whiteboard.
We were just discussing that before class.
Discussing this coming over here. So, so hopefully what you realize is, do we have any more colored markers? Daisy, any colored markers kicking around? Okay, so when we're using, you're thinking of course, above ground biomass, right? And we're taking that above ground biomass, which is all derived from CO2 out of the atmosphere. We're harvesting it, we're breaking it down, we're turning it into fuel, we're burning that fuel. The CO2 is going back up, but it's going to come back in through the form of photosynthesis. So you can get it to very low carbon emissions on just that basis. You with me so far? But your question is one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And so the question is, can you use it to, in fact, sequester carbon? Okay? So this is going to be hard without other colors. So
They can see a root, so it's okay.
yeah, I feel like the UPS commercial guy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm not nearly as clever. So years 1 through 6. And so this switchgrass, as an example, remember it's a perennial. So whereas a corn plant will put down roots about a foot, foot and a half, switchgrass puts down roots like 8, 9, 10 feet. And that root structure doesn't go away, okay? So everybody imagine green, right? So we have this above ground biomass, and you don't get 100% yield in year 1, right? But you typically do by year 2. Oh, look at that. Now we don't have to imagine. Okay, so here we go, year 1, 2, right? And this thing is just like, think of it as like the giant grass in your lawn. It just keeps growing back, right? And yeah, and so each year you're coming along and you're harvesting that biomass and you're turning it into fuel, right? Okay. Now there's also a carbon cost with transportation and all that, so it's not zero, right? It's not zero, okay? But if we look, you know, I think over time at just call it biomass, you know, it looks something like that, okay? But they also put down these root structures. Now, they don't put the complete root structure down in the first year, but let's just say they do something that looks like this. And the answer to this, guys, is a giant we don't know, okay? So we don't know, but at some point, I certainly imagine that if we now look at roots, maybe it takes a little bit longer, but it doesn't put down root structure forever, right? It gets down to 10 feet or whatever. It builds some massive root structure, and then it's not going to get any bigger. With me so far? Okay. Now, as Bob pointed out, I used to be a venture capitalist, so I'm not a philanthropist, okay? I don't want to sell seed just once and have the farmer keep a stand for 30 years. I want to sell them seed again. Maybe not in year 2, but let's just imagine that I want to sell them seed again in year 5, because I'm going to continue to have a breeding and improvement program. I'm going to have version 2.0, okay? So what happens then if you come along, right? Anybody ever, like you've seen Roundup, right? Right? Spray Roundup. You'll kill the aerial portion of the plant. You'll also kill this below ground portion. Now, some of this stuff that's near the surface will rot and release CO2, but most of it will not. Most of it should stay permanently sequestered. In fact, over the long term, it'll just turn into soil, right? Then we come along with version 2.0, right? And we start over again with a new root structure, some of which will feed off of this root structure here. And so again, the big I don't know is we don't know, we haven't been able to quantitate this. This is difficult work to do because you literally have to come along with a backhoe, right? Dig a 10-foot deep section, right? Pull the plant out, wash the roots off, weigh it all, right? It's hard to figure. But the experts that I've talked to, and we work with them, they think this is about 10 tons per acre. That certainly after a 5-year period, you would have about 10 tons of below ground biomass. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
So that sequestered biomass, is that, so that sequestered biomass, is that going to be greater or less than the amount of carbon that it takes to, put into these plants every year and
Yes.
transportation and all that?
Much greater, because the Vogel work that I showed you, we know that just doing this is like 94% GHG reduction, okay? So you're at about 6% that you need to make up. And so that 10 tons, I know I'm talking about percentages and trying to compare tons, but it's in vast excess. And so what it does is it makes these fuels, in fact, carbon negative, because you should sequester that. And right, and then at what price carbon, right? What do you think your carbon cap and trade number is in 2030, right? If it's $50, then that's another $500 per acre that's going the grower's way. That's big dollars in the Midwest and other geographies. So again, caveat, we don't know, but we think that this works, and we think that by managing stands appropriately and replacing them at the appropriate time intervals with appropriate varieties, we think we can continue to sequester even more carbon.
Any other questions?
As an
Mike.
expert in this field, what would you say are some reasonable expectations we can have for, say, the next 5 years in terms of how your company is going?
Yeah, how does my company go? So right now, the biggest bottleneck to doing this is putting steel in the ground to build the biorefineries. And the way the math has worked is it's all about the capital cost of putting this steel in the ground. So if you go back a couple of years and you wanted to build a cornstarch facility, so forget about your operating costs, which are driven by corn prices per bushel. Just talk about the steel that needs to go in the ground. So a couple of years ago, to build a cornstarch facility, the CapEx, or the capital expenditure to do that, was about $1 per gallon. Okay, so if you wanted to build a 100 million gallon per year plant, which is sort of the standard size today, it was $100 million. Right, the price of steel and everything else went through the roof. It was $2. I haven't checked as to what it is lately. But by comparison, right, these cellulosic biorefineries, I sort of describe them as the ultimate flat screen TV, right? We know these first few are going to be god-awful expensive, and by comparison, they're about $5 per annual gallon of capacity. So what do you think the financial community is doing today financing something that expensive? They're not even lending to one another, right? And so the biggest bottleneck, right, is getting those things in the ground. And so, but nonetheless, the government has a program of grants and loan guarantees. There's one that's been built, one that's up and running in Alabama, another one that's under construction in Georgia, one in Kansas, one in Wisconsin. So we're doing it. And so what I envision is, over some period of time, people see that the first generation works, right? And then the bean counters start to go, well, what's the operating cost? How do you do this? Or how does that work? And then you get the financial community do the second generation. The big question mark for all of us is the global economy and the concomitant price of oil, because the question that I haven't gotten, but which I should, is at what price does all this work? And running the math forward on what we think we can do on yields and what the refining technologies think they can do, and what you run up against is farm labor costs. And I really don't think you're going to see this in the United States cheaper than like $40 a barrel, right? It closed at 34 today. So $40 sounds real attractive when it's at 147, but less so when it's at 35. The Brazilians, with their lower farm labor costs, they can probably get it down into the low to mid 30s with mature technology. But that's what I see the next sort of 5-10 years in.
Julie, do you have a question?
What do you think about natural gas as an alternative energy source, especially with the buses here in LA?
Better than coal, right? Better than gasoline. T-Boone is clearly long gas, right? T-Boone is right at the Pickens plant. Everybody know who T-Boone Pickens is? Big oil, wildcatter. But it's still CO2 up the stack, right? So it's better, but it's not zero. The thing, if you're worried about carbon, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't be, you should. But when you look at it on a global basis, it gets driven by, the global carbon emissions get driven almost completely by power generation in China and India. Chinese are building a coal-fired power plant every week, one a week. They don't think they should read by candlelight. So you've got to, if you're concerned about carbon emissions, you got to fix the power piece. Transportation fuels are about 20% of global greenhouse emissions, whereas power is about 60%.
And that's where all the carbon's being burned. Dora, do you have a question? Faria, do you have a question? For Richard?
No.
No? Faria?
Yes?
Go ahead.
Oh no, I don't have a question.
You do or you don't?
It's okay, there's one in the back.
Samantha has a question. Then I'm going to have some questions.
Okay, so I know you were talking about biofuels today, but
Yep.
just for background information, can you explain more of the hydrogen technology and why we're not going to use that other than just the fact that it's hard to, you said store and transport?
Well, it's hard to make, so you got to figure out where you're going to make it. Steam stripping natural gas is clearly not the answer because that's still CO2 out the stack. So that leaves you with electrolysis of water, which you could use, right, any kind of electricity, whether it's nuclear power or wind or solar. That becomes very, very expensive to do that. And then the problem with hydrogen is, right, it's the top left of the periodic table, right? It's the smallest atom, and so trying to pipe it it leaks. It leaks. It's tough to have seals. It's tough to compress and put in a tank. So you almost have to build this whole new infrastructure to be able to do it.
Are there any other atoms that we could use?
To make hydrogen, you mean?
No, not hydrogen. Are there any other, I mean, we're talking about
Well,
compounds mostly here.
So other fuel molecules. Yeah, good question, because I didn't really touch on that, because you shouldn't get the impression that ethanol is the end-all and be-all. So a little startup out of Caltech called GEVO, and then BP and DuPont, trying to keep all this stuff straight in my head, BP and DuPont, they have a joint venture to ferment a butanol, so a 4-carbon alcohol. Then Jim Lau here at UCLA, he's done some metabolic engineering and come up with a 6-carbon alcohol, right? So the more carbon bonds you have, the more power you're going to have, the more energy. So that's very cutting edge stuff. There's a company called LS9 and another company called Amyris that use genetic engineering, metabolic engineering to go to long chain alkanes, so very gasoline-like molecules. And then there's some catalyst technologies that are taking us to diesel-like molecules. So I think there's a lot of different carbon-based molecules that you can go to, all of which, to your question, maybe it was yours, fit into the existing infrastructure, right? All the existing pipelines, the existing gas stations, the existing gas tanks. You don't want to pay to replace all that, guys. Go ahead.
Were those molecules you were talking about produced by bacteria or?
Yes, all of them are produced. The butanol, Amyris, yeah, they're all produced using genetically engineered bacteria.
We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple
So
of minutes.
in some cases, yeast, right? So.
Are there any other questions for Richard? One of the things that Richard said, which was very important, I think I pointed out at least 2 times. So I want you to think about the fact that Wright brothers and then Apollo landing on the moon. I know none of you were born then when Apollo landed on the moon, but I remember that, you know, these are there's a couple moments in your life that you never forget. One of mine was when I walked out of chemistry class in 1963 and found out that John F. Kennedy had been shot and assassinated. I'll never forget that. And I'll also never forget being in my apartment when I was in graduate school with all of my graduate school colleagues watching the lander on the moon. That was only 66 years, and I think that that's something that you should keep in mind. And I think he also pointed out, Richard, what I pointed out to you on Tuesday, and that was Mendel's laws of genetics were only rediscovered 100 years ago. So you think about all the power of the ingenuity that can be released in this country and all over the world with enough resources, meaning financial resources, and enough entrepreneurs, along with people working in universities using technology, thinking about new technologies. Imagine how all of this can come to fruition. And I think what Richard said you should keep in mind, and that is using this technology, you can supply a very significant, if not all, of the world's transportation fuel supply simply from renewable resources from plants, applying the most state-of-the-art genetics and biotechnology, and of course other kinds of technologies too. And I think that that's very important that you should, as a take-home message. But then I'm going to put you on the spot, Richard, just a little bit, because I know that you didn't want me to, that you didn't want to talk about this, but you're one of the experts and probably one of the most street-smart individuals that I've ever known. So the question then is, what if someone in this room wanted to make a little startup that would be able to be working on this particular problem? How would they go about starting their company?
There's a lot of different ways to do that.
Because Richard's done this many times, so you have a chance to talk to the expert here about how to start a biotech company.
So I think, let me just see if I can, off the top of my head, organize some thoughts about entrepreneurialism. One thing is that we live in a very entrepreneurial culture, right? You might not know who some of the other, you might not know who Norman Borlaug is, but you all know who Stephen Jobs is, right? Right? An entrepreneur, a guy who in a garage, right, started a computer company, right? Some of you probably know who Fred Smith is, right, who founded Federal Express. Most of you probably know who Jeff Bezos is, right, who founded Amazon, right? So we have, in the United States, a very entrepreneurial culture. And you don't see that duplicated just culturally in a lot of places in the world, although I have to say the Chinese are coming up fast. The other thing that you have in the United States, in addition to sort of an entrepreneurial culture, is what I'll call an entrepreneurial infrastructure, okay? So you have a whole host of people who are sort of used to dealing with entrepreneurs, right? So if you walk into a lawyer's office at a firm like our firm, like Sherman and Sterling, and say, I want to start a company, they don't look at you like you're a Martian, okay? They know, oh, okay, you'll need, articles of incorporation, and you'll need, right? They know the basic legal framework that needs to be done to start up a company, because people here are doing it all the time. Same thing with accountants. And probably most importantly, what we have here, which again is not duplicated in very many other countries in the world, is we have sources of risk capital. Okay, we typically call it venture capital or private equity. But we have people who are willing to take money, and I don't want to call it uncollateralized lending, but they will lend you the money in return for a share of the company, okay? So most banks, especially today, right, if I went to like Wells Fargo and said, I've got this great idea, I need to borrow $1 million, they'll say, great, what's your collateral? Well, sign your, right, I want you to sign your home or something as collateral, right? The other, right, if you can't go to the banks, who are you going to go to? So the joke in the industry, in the venture capital, is always the 3 Fs, right? You can go to friends, you can go to family, and you can go to fools, okay? None of them, right, the 3 Fs are not good source of capital. But what you can do is go to a venture capitalist. And what a venture capitalist does is he takes money from several different institutional investors. So anybody know what CalPERS is, the California Public Employee Retirement System. So, right, Bob's pension along with every other public employee in the state of California, gets put into a huge pot, and they need to invest that pot. So they take some tiny portion of it, and they'll invest it in a venture capital fund. And one of the most famous venture capital firms is a firm called Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers. So they'll take some money from CalPERS. They'll take some money from the state of Wisconsin. They'll take some money from whoever got ExxonMobil, whoever's got money to invest in this particular asset class, right? Some people buy stocks, some people buy bonds, some people buy REITs, some people invest in venture capital funds. And so they'll take this money And it can be significant pools of capital, say $100 million. And with that $100 million, they'll typically make about 10 investments. So they'll have $10 million into Steve's company, $10 million into Michael, Rose, Jessica's, Bob's, and so forth. They'll make those 10 different investments. And what typically happens is that about 9 of them fail. Okay? About 9 of them, they either lose all the money or maybe they make their money back. And the 1/10 is usually a big success. And so Kleiner Perkins won their first venture firm that they raised. I can't remember how much money it was. I think it was a $40 million fund, but they made 13 investments, 11 of which you've never heard of. And the other 2 were Genentech and Apple Computer. Okay, so the winners pay for the losers. And so when you then average out their returns over a 10-year period, the top performing venture capital funds will return 20, 25% on an annualized basis. That's right, treasuries are at 0 today, right? Remember, I said the top 25% of venture funds, the bottom performing venture funds don't even return capital. So just like any other, like a mutual fund manager, there's a range of performance. But nonetheless, we have this, and I can't remember the amount of money that's in the US venture capital system, but it's billions, okay, it's a billion, right, compared to what's available in other geographies. And so because we have this pool of capital that's literally designed to fund entrepreneurs, you combine that with our entrepreneurial infrastructure, entrepreneurial culture, and we have many, 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 many more startups in the United States than you typically see. And it also gets enhanced by the investments that the government makes in basic research, development, and technology. Because you see a lot of these companies, like Cirrus, being spun out of technologies that are originally developed at UCLA or MIT or Stanford, et cetera, et cetera. So to be an entrepreneur, you need to be a little bit crazy. You need to have a very good idea. But people do this every day. They write business plans. They submit them to venture capitalists. They go in. They convince those people to invest in them, and they do. They're not always 20-year-old college students, by the way. So, but sometimes they are. Is that satisfactory, Bob?
It's always excellent, Richard. But I'm going to ask you another one in a second. Any other questions? Davis? Aggies? Brian, you have any questions? You're laughing. One of the things that is unique about you, Richard, that I've always loved, is that you had a hardcore science training, but yet you are the chief executive officer of a very cutting-edged company. So what was it, if you can share with the students in the class, was your personal journey and how you made the decision to switch from doing science into doing business, which I'm sure wasn't an easy decision, of which many kids in the class here may face, or face similar decisions of going in one area and then deciding that they want to make a complete switch to a different area?
Well, I actually, by the way, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, I watched it live too. I was 7. But I got interested in biotechnology, and you remember, because I seen I think it was the Newsweek magazine that you still have at your house, and it was in 1977 or 1978, and Genentech first went public and set a then Wall Street record for price appreciation in one day. And the name of the article was called Turning Genes into Greens. And that's what stimulated my interest in biotechnology. So yes, I am a capitalist. So I got interested, and then, I love science. I think science is really, really interesting. I think science, especially at the graduate level, where you're forced to hone your thinking to be a rigorous thinker about what are the facts and what are not the facts, and that has held me in good stead. I think that a background in science, and specifically in my case in molecular biology, simply reduces the amount of time it takes to make good decisions about technically oriented things. I'm in a technical field, so all that's positive. At the end of the day, for me, I like working at the interface of technology and business. I like commercializing technology. For me, staying in academia was a little bit too esoteric. It works for some people, doesn't work for me. And so I really enjoy being on that interface. And it just so happens that I have sort of the combination of personality skills and organizational skills and analytical skills to make that happen.
One of the things that we've talked about many times, because as I've shared with all of you, Richard and I are pretty good friends, was the idea that you have that you can't really predict the future. And you alluded that in this talk today in a limited amount of way. But would you like, if you could, share for the students in the class all the things of technologies that didn't pan out that they might be familiar with, so that one can't really predict from today in our experience what's going to happen tomorrow, because you alluded that to Paul Ehrlich, whose hot air I have to listen to every time I go to the National Academy of Sciences meeting. The guy hasn't changed in 30 years. But the point here is that I think you ought to share
it's
that.
what I call
this is good. You have to listen to Richard Buzz.
Sort of
it's insightful.
The thrill of the not so new, I think I call it. And it sort of ties into the venture capital question. When I was a venture capitalist, people would always ask me, well, how do you value technology? Like there is some magic formula. Oh, this is what your company's worth. And at the end of the day, how do you determine the value of a car? Demand, market. Market set prices. So prices of houses, right, very much on the decline today, but it gets set by the market. And so a price for a technology company like Cirrus gets set by the market. Well, whatever the market will bear is what the value of my company is, right? And many business people use sort of traditional parameters like price earnings ratios and things like that. And the problem, especially in biotechnology, is that the product development life cycles are so long that many times the companies need financing before there's obvious earnings, right? And so how do I value that technology? How do I know which technologies are going to work? And what's really fun is to go back and look at all these technologies that people said were either going to work or not work, and realize, sort of how fantastically wrong they were. So like steam engines were used as water pumps in agriculture for like 50 years before somebody invented the locomotive, right? And I have a list of all these great quotes where I'll try to remember some of them. The AT&T, who passed on Alexander Graham's patents in telephony. The American Telegraph Company, it was called. And they said, the telephone has too many practical limitations for us to be interested. We're going to stick with telegraphs. And who is it? Can't remember his name. The guy who was the founder of DEC Computer. Tom Watson Sr., who was the founder of IBM, said, it was in like 1953, said, I think there's a world market for about 4 computers. He's a little bit off. Ken Olsen, who was the founder of DEC Equipment, said, a computer in somebody's home? Why would they want that? And I think it was in 1981, Bill Gates said, 180K ought to be enough for everybody. Right, he's talking about memory. So it's difficult to predict technology trends, and it's only really recently, and I think especially your generation, that you begin to accept innovation and change as the norm. Because for most of human history, that has not been the case. For most of human history, men have lived pretty much exactly as their grandfathers did. And you live nothing like your grandfathers did, right? So this pace of change and innovation, I think, is really interesting. Everybody watched the Summer Olympics this summer, right? And so one of the things that's really interesting is, global population growth, which Paul Ehrlich was very worried about. I actually get very excited about, not because I think I want more hungry mouths on the planet to feed, but because I want more brains to innovate. And I brought up the Chinese Olympics, everybody watched Michael Phelps, right? So in China, right, if you're a 1 in a million athlete, it means there's 1,000 other people just like you. Yeah, do the math, right? And so China is now, the last time I checked, graduating something like 1 million scientists and engineers per year, right? So when I say global population growth, I don't really mean growth per se, I mean development. Because, yeah, I believe in conservation, but I don't think we're going to conserve our way out of our problems. We're going to have to innovate our way out of our problems as well. And that means more gray matter at work. So get to it.
But that's your future, by far. Let's give Richard a big round of applause.
Thank you.